Former President Trump vowing to fight the guilty verdict as he calls it a great honor. It says donations pour in after the unprecedented conviction. NTD's Iris Tao has more from Trump's press conference earlier today at Trump Tower.
Less than a day after he was convicted on all 34 counts of falsifying business records, former President Trump vows to appeal the conviction, which he calls an honor.
It's a very unpleasant thing, to be honest, but it's a great, great honor because I'm willing to do whatever I have to do to save our country and to save our Constitution. I don't mind. So we will continue the fight.
That said, Trump called the trial very unfair, citing several potential grounds for appeal, including trial's venue, the judge himself, and witnesses who are not called.
We're going to be appealing it on many different things. He wouldn't allow us to have witnesses. He wouldn't allow us to talk.
He also told us that he had wanted to testify on his own behalf, but was warned against doing so.
And don't testify, because they'll get you on something that you said slightly wrong, and then they sue you for perjury.
That's as Trump's campaign announced this morning that it raised a record $34.8 million from small dollar donors, all within a 10-hour period. And Trump touting a new poll.
Last night, right after the verdict, where I'm up 6 points.
And President Biden's campaign, meanwhile, is also fundraising off Trump's verdict, telling voters that the threat Trump poses to our democracy has never been greater, adding that the only way to stop Trump would be at the ballot box. And now Judge Juan Merchan has set a sentencing hearing in this case for July 11th, just a few days before the RNC, or Republican National Convention, where Trump will get officially nominated. And any appeal will have to come after the sentencing. Reporting from New York City, Iris Tao, NTD News.
With Trump's guilty verdict, he is still the presumptive Republican nominee for President of the United States. Meanwhile, President Biden breaking his silence on the matter earlier today, describing Trump's response to the verdict as dangerous. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley is at the White House with more.
President Biden, addressing reporters today at the White House, says that the verdict in Trump's New York case shows that nobody is above the law.
And it's reckless, it's dangerous, it's irresponsible for anyone to say this was rigged just because they don't like the verdict.
Earlier this week, the Biden campaign held a news conference just outside the courtroom in New York with Robert De Niro and 2 former January 6 police officers showing up. And this was a major change in the Biden campaign's approach to this trial, because they previously have been pretty quiet on this case. Trump's campaign has said that the Biden campaign has been behind this trial since the very beginning and weaponizing the Justice Department, and that this only confirms their narrative. Reporting from the White House, Jack Bradley, NTD News.
What process must former President Trump follow to appeal Thursday's guilty verdict? Joining me now to assess the case and how the appellate process works is Nima Rahmani, the president and co-founder of West Coast Trial Lawyers. Nima Rahmani, thank you so much for joining.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. Yesterday, obviously marking a historic day for a former president, the first in history to be convicted, as it was the first time. Could you tell us, does this verdict of guilty on 34 counts indicate that the evidence presented was strong, in your opinion?
I think the evidence was stronger than I thought, but it was not the strongest case. I think this was more of a case where the defense made a series of errors that potentially cost them the case. They really didn't put up much of a defense. They made the case entirely about Michael Cohen and cross-examining him and arguing that he's a liar. They didn't address the independent evidence of Donald Trump's guilt, including the recording of him talking about Karen McDougal, the handwritten notes from Trump CFO Alan Weisselberg that showed the grossed up amounts, and importantly, David Pecker's testimony. He was head of the Inquirer and the prosecution's first witness. And we know he's an important witness because the jurors asked for a readback, and shortly after they got that readback, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts.
Now, the judge provided, as we've all been talking about, 50 pages of jury instructions, all of which jurors were not allowed to take into deliberations with them. They could only audibly take them in from the judge. Are you surprised that the jury may have reached the verdict so quickly despite this limitation? And some have also argued that said instructions pigeonholed the jury into a guilty verdict. What are your thoughts on that suspicion?
Well, New York is unique in a bad way in that the jurors were not given written copies of the instructions in the deliberation room. And I'm here in California, and I've practiced in state and federal courts, and the jurors always get the instructions. It makes the process a lot easier, but that's one of the intricacies of New York law. And speaking of intricacies of New York law, we know from this case that false business records are just a misdemeanor unless they cover up or aid or further another crime. And that was a big issue in this case. Was that additional crime election fraud? Was it a campaign finance violation? Was it a tax crime? And one takeaway was maybe because of the statute of limitations, but the jurors were not given the opportunity to return guilty verdicts on misdemeanors only. That would have meant that the business records were false and fraudulent, but there was no other crime. And given the nature of the instructions and the potential statute of limitations that may have run on misdemeanor counts, the jurors were put in an all or nothing situation where they had to return not guilty verdicts or verdicts on felony charges.
Now, earlier today at a press conference at Trump Tower in New York, Trump announced his intention to appeal the verdict. Can he appeal before the July 11th sentencing? And additionally, can he file an expedited appeal for a decision before the election? Please walk us through what the appellate process will look like.
Also, intricacies of New York. The lowest court, the trial court in New York, is the Supreme Court. So Trump can't really take an interlocutory appeal. That's an appeal before a final judgment. He's going to have to wait until that July 11th sentencing. He's going to have 30 days to appeal to the New York Appellate Division. That's the first appellate court there, and he gets that appeal as a matter of right. And we know the types of arguments he's going to make on appeal. He's going to argue that the unanimity or lack thereof with respect to the other crime was a violation of his rights. He's going to argue that Judge Juan Merchan should have recused himself or been disqualified, that the venue should have changed, that the gag order was unconstitutional. At the Sandoval hearing was overbroad, which would have allowed evidence of his other legal problems, including the Jean Carroll defamation verdicts, the New York civil fraud verdict, as well as the violations of the gag order to come into evidence if he testified. So we're going to hear a lot of arguments like that, including potential vagueness of the charges on appeal. After that first appeal, then he has a discretionary appeal to the highest court in New York, which happens to be called the New York Court of Appeal. If that appeal is rejected or denied, and Trump has a constitutional argument, by constitutional I mean federal constitutional argument, he can potentially appeal this case to the United States Supreme Court as well.
Is there any way, Nima, just briefly, is there any way that the Supreme Court could insert themselves at any point before those?
It's unlikely that the Supreme Court could insert itself. Trump is going to have to work through the New York State Appellate Court process first, and it's going to take time. Transcripts have to be prepared, briefs filed, oral arguments. So I don't expect much, if any of this, to happen before the November election.
Nima Rahmani, really appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Steve.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.